Hello, alumni activists. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining Alums for Campus Fairness as we kick off our newest webinar series, Investigating Modern Conspiracy Theories. My name is Neely Yarkey, and I am the Assistant Director of Alums for Campus Fairness. I am thrilled to be joined this evening by both Dr. Andrew Pessin and the author of Conspiracy U himself, Mr. Scott Shay. Dr. Pessin has been guiding this five-part series using Scott's book to explore conspiracy theories from the left and the right. Scott Shay is a leading businessman, thought leader, and author of several widely read books on profound issues facing our Jewish community. I am so excited to welcome them both to the stage.
Thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to be here. As those who've been following know, this is session 3 of the 5-part course, and it's such a treat and a pleasure that we have Scott with us tonight. We get to chat with him for a while before we return to our course. So Scott, welcome to the show, as we might say. Welcome to the course on your book.
Andrew, it's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. As I mentioned the first day of the webinar, how impressed I am by your work, not just your career as a successful businessman, but that you turn to writing these books, and the books you've written are so valuable and so essential and so impressive. And it's a real honor to have the privilege of leading people through your most recent book. You mentioned just before we started, and as I think about it, maybe it'd be a good thing to talk about a little bit. The material you're talking about in the book is obviously focused on campuses, but what we know is what starts on campus doesn't stay on campus. And indeed, I think we could agree that these movements that have been brewing on campus over the last 10 to 20 years have now blossomed way beyond campus. And most recently in the news, you mentioned the issue with the Morningstar investment situation. So maybe you could tell some folks what that is and how it's relevant to the issues that are going on in your book.
Well, one of the things that I was wondering about as I was reading all of these BDS resolutions was just why was it so important for resolutions to talk about divestment? It didn't really make a lot of sense that student bodies would be voting to divest stocks. I mean, it would make more sense in a certain kind of way to for students to vote to do academic boycotts, to ban birthright Israel, to whatever, things that are a little more relevant. And as I got into doing the research, I fell upon a little bit of ESG, environmental social governance research. And to my surprise, I was looking at it, and it cited a Brown University student resolution that for BDS, a non-binding resolution that had no impact. And here it is actually showing up in research by Morningstar Sustainalytics. And this is a screening service for $17 trillion of US equity investments, about the size of our GDP, a little less than the size of the GDP. And to make a long story short, the BDS folks were actually quite brilliant, because a lot of this research is being done by a small group. And if they could get this small group of people doing ESG research to be writing negative articles, negative research, and giving lower ESG scores to companies that are related to Israel, then wow, they could harm Israel and nobody would even know it. Andrew, in your 401k, you may have been boycotting Israel without knowing it, because Sustainalytics, through whoever your provider was giving lower scores to Israeli companies. So on the one hand, you have Startup Nation, where people are mindfully making investments in Israel. And on the other hand, you have these efforts to create boycotts of Israel that nobody's able to talk about because they don't even know it.
That must have been a scary moment to discover that. It's not uncommon after these student BDS resolutions. And by the way, there was just one last night at Case Western Reserve University. They just passed one. And incidentally, the president of Case Western put out an impressively strong statement condemning the anti-Semitism of the BDS movement, which is a rare response of a university official. But in any case, it's sort of common for at least some people to downplay the problem on campus. So they pass a BDS resolution, no impact, no effect. Israel's economy has been booming for the last, 10, 20 years, et cetera, et cetera. Who cares about BDS? So when you have that moment, it turns out, a stealth boycott is in fact happening, and these resolutions are having exactly that impact.
Well, speaking now personally, so when I had this recognition, I thought this is really bad. And I started writing. So I did some research, wrote about it in the book, but then I wrote a essay, a smear by any other name. And then I wrote a boycott that the Jewish community has to combat. And then I wrote a boycott, then I wrote an article which got a lot of coverage. Indeed, I know that some of the state's attorney generals read this article. It was called Morningstar's Modified Limited Hangout. And for those of us old enough to remember the Nixon administration, they'll know what I was talking about. But this was a really long piece. It was 5,000 words. But I needed it to be out there in a relatively detailed way, and it got some attention, and the Jewish community started to get together. And JFNA, the Jewish Federations of North America, along with a host of other groups, the ADL, AJC, Brandeis Center, the Lewis Brandeis Center, not the university, all got together and we wrote a letter. I was part of that group to Morningstar, and we actually caused some change there. So it was really a great moment in that, by recognizing the problem, which is what groups like Alums for Campus Fairness are trying to do, and then creating a coordinated response, you can actually create change. And Morningstar put out a press release that we agreed to a set of issues. I mean, they were doing things like marking down companies for building barriers under Israeli ground in Israeli territory to combat the Hamas terrorist tunnels, because they conflated that with the wall.
Right.
We pointed out things like, and I don't want to give too long an answer to this, but I'll just give one thing that just was mind-blowing. They marked down tremendously Bezek because it offers cellular services in the West Bank, and along, by the way, with Jordanian services, but they didn't mark down Russian Telecom for forcing people in Crimea to use Russian Telecom and banning the Ukrainian cell phone operators. So we were saying, look, even if you assume that Israel one day just really occupied this territory in the same way that Russia did, you're still giving Russia the benefit. And surprise, surprise, the only company being marked down is Israel. And by the way, we found the same thing in the Punjab with India Airtel, and it goes on and on.
Right.
So it was really it's really anti-Semitism.
Right. No, anyone who studies these campus issues for 5 minutes realizes the double standards that are applied to Israel, as you point out in the book very clearly. And it's so painful to see them being applied in these contexts. It's quite shocking. Do you trust? My understand these issues are very complex to me, financial issues, et cetera. How transparent are their scoring processes? Can they just say they're fixing things, but how can you confirm that they're really making those changes?
So, first of all, just getting the data is very hard because you have to pay for their services. You can't just log on and see what they're doing. You have to go and, so I said in the book, and if for those who looked in the footnotes, basically I got the data by going to friends. I am somewhat connected in the financial community. I went to companies that were using this research and individuals that were using the research and actually getting access to it.
That's
and
great.
Looking at it. but I couldn't cite it much more precisely in terms of where I was getting it. I was looking at the actual research, but I couldn't cite it because people who were working at these companies, but very upset, just gave it to me. And I was able to ask for certain things. Now, to Morningstar's credit, they gave the group credentials. So we could actually enter and act like any client.
I see.
And it was full credentials. Again, once we got them engaged, I have to give them credit. I have to give Joe Mansueto and Kunal Kapoor credit, the chairman and CEO respectively, because we were able to go in, we were able to find the data, show them that 74% of all criticisms of companies in occupied territories relate to Israel.
Right.
If you gaze out at the world and you see Ukraine and Tibet and a whole bunch of other, Punjab, I just named a few, Southern Sudan, Western Sahara, and 74% of the problems in the world relate to Israel, you got a problem.
Right.
And but the thing that is part of this settlement, part of this agreement, is that they will give us some access on an ongoing basis, which
that's amazing.
is part of the deal.
And that access means you can check how they're scoring these relevant stocks and companies and see that the process is fairer. Yes.
Non-commercially, I mean, I don't, what they decide on a commercial basis, fine. That we've got no gripe with, good,
Right.
bad. But with respect to this narrow area of Israel, yes, we can do that.
Do you think so? How did the BDS folks get in there in the first place, and how did Morningstar fall for it in the first? Were they just not paying attention, relying on third parties, or do you think there was complicitness on Morningstar's part? Like they knew what was happening and were okay with it?
So here's the thing. This started with a subsidiary. ESG has taken off I explained this a little bit in the book. It came from nowhere. And then it's starting in the sort of 12, 13, 14, it really started to grow. There was a company called Sustainalytics that saw this early, based in Europe. And they took on a number of assignments for pro-BDS groups and pension funds. There's some pension funds that every 6 months announce that they're divesting from Israel. I don't know how they can do that, but they have to make that announcement every so often. Well, they actually paid this company money to do research. And Morningstar made a minority investment in the company early on. It was a good idea because they saw ESG growing. Then they grew it to 40%. Then they grew it to they bought it entirely 100%. And meanwhile, Sustainalytics, while denying that they had anything to do with the BDS movement, according to if you see in the modified limited hangout article, an employee admits in a study. I don't want to go into all the sources right now, but you can see it. It's footnoted that they are creating, even though they're claiming to be anti-BDS, they're providing the lists that the pro-BDS Norwegian, Danish pension funds and other funds are using for BDS. So they're actually giving them their list, but saying, no, we're not BDS.
Right.
And the funny thing is, I was able to show that I wasn't able to show, but they again, I don't want to, it's a long story here, yeah. But they were criticizing companies for the exact same thing in their research, for doing something and say, we're really not doing it.
Right.
I mean, it was literally identical.
Yeah.
And that's the nice thing with being the judge, jury, and prosecutor.
Right. Well, it's such an important story, as you said at the beginning, because it gives one hope, because the hope is when you shine a light on the nasty doings, and that gives people resources and it motivates people to fix the nasty doings and respond to them and make change happen. And this is obviously a success story. And, I certainly feel the same way about your book. It is shining a light on what's really a crisis in the academy. And the hope is this can get to enough people will get upset about it. And with that light shining, we can begin to make some of those changes that are obviously so necessary, really, in some ways, from the ground up in the academy. I think given the way you diagnose the problems. In the few more minutes that we have, let me just ask, let's just change gears for a little bit. What impressed me so much about you, as I mentioned at the beginning, that you have this career as a successful businessman, and then you decide to start writing books. And you have the earlier book, Getting Our Groove Back, and then In Good Faith and Conspiracy. You were, I think, the three. That's what you've got,
Yep,
the three,
that's it.
right? Yeah. So, what makes somebody like you, and these are all, Jewish related, Israel related topics. What makes you divert from that career and spend time writing these books?
Well, I guess to a certain degree, I'm probably a frustrated writer. Even going back, I was an editor of my high school newspaper. I actually reported for the Daily Northwestern, but I thought that in all candor, I thought finance would be more lucrative. And so
I can confirm that it is.
so I went in that direction, but I'm one of those people that believes that you can be in the business world, be in the finance world, and make a contribution in the Jewish communal world as well. I don't know, there's all sorts of moral philosophies about that, but
Right.
and you are the one to talk about those. But I think that, sort of in a way that I can make, I couldn't have had the impact personally on Morningstar and on helping bring this together. And there were lots of others, Julie Hammerman, a lot of Breitman, and Bayevsky. I mean, I want to shout out a lot of people who were in there, and Jeremy Pava. But the fact that I was chairman of Signature Bank,
Yeah.
and $100 billion bank, helped.
Yeah. Right.
It helped. If I were not, and I don't mean this in any kind of net, but I felt like I was playing an important role. And on some of this, my business career actually, it provides a bit of a hechsher, and it helps.
Yeah.
And so I think, the place that Getting Our Groove Back came from, which is a book about Getting Our Groove Back, how to energize American Jewry, was by looking at all of the different philanthropic efforts that American Jews are making, and what's most effective. And I really tried to do it. The book is like a business plan for American Jewry. There's a lot of dollars and cents and studies in there. How to get the bank. I have a big saying. I have my slogan is, we don't want to be nice, we want to be effective. There are lots of programs that are nice. The important thing is, and lots of people are nice, and the people behind the organization are nice, but what's most effective? Where can we get the biggest bang for the buck? And so I put my business person's hat on with my Jewish community volunteer hat, and that's where that book came from. In Good Faith was different in a great way, because that came from reading Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett,
the new atheists, as they call themselves.
Yes, and even How to Read the Bible by Professor Kugel. And these folks better than me, being a philosopher. And I really found that I had friends, and occasionally myself, who were really shaken by some of the things that they said. And I had more than a few occasions where people came to me and asked questions, not because I was a rabbi or something, but because I was a friend, and they had read this book, and I was at Shabbat dinners where things would come up. And I really felt there was a need to write a responsa. And I have to say, I was encouraged by, and I also want to say, a very important person in many people's lives, Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs, who actually gave me the name for the book. And he really encouraged my writing, I have to say. I mean, I owe him a great deal, a huge debt. for his encouragement, because it took me a long time to write that book. It was 5 years. And there were times when I just didn't know if I could keep going.
Yeah, it's always easier to stop writing than it is to continue writing. So
Yeah, you got it. And the thing I prefer to have written than to write.
right.
But so that one I wanted to, but it was a life passion. And I really wanted to write the book. The part on science in the Bible, I'd wanted to write that my entire life.
Yeah.
So I got that out. There were other things, prayer, the section on prayer. Again, I really felt it was important to me. It was actually self-beneficial. I pray very differently after I read the book.
Yeah.
The Conspiracy U, I didn't want to write. I had no intention of writing the book, particularly so soon after In Good Faith. It's a long answer, but I made the decision after I was starting to write something about my father, and when Arthur Butts at Northwestern had come out as a Holocaust denier, Professor Butts, and then Dr. Stephen Thrasher gave a talk that made the front page in the New York Times at the NYU convocation, where he, blessed, lauded, praised PDS, and of course, at the same time, while he was writing tweets that, mocked the concentration camps. And,
right. I'll be talking about some of those tonight. So
good. So then, and I happened to, at the same time, see the dean of his school. He was in for, like a cocktail party. And I realized the Northwestern at the time reaffirmed that they were going to hire him. He was due to start as the Daniel H. Renberg Chair of Social Justice Reporting. And it got me angry. And I started doing more research on what he had written, other professors at Northwestern were writing. And I just felt this is a book that needed to be written. It wasn't a book I wanted to write. I wish someone else had would have written this book in a certain kind of way. But it really needed to be written. And it was, as you say, a plea, which is why I'm so delighted that the Alums for Campus Fairness are doing. It's a plea for alums to pay attention and to help organize. And it's not, I've been made more or less persona non grata at Northwestern as a result of this book.
Well, that anticipates what would be my last question, which is, how has Northwestern responded to this? You not only, you're an alum, I believe your children are alums, and you've been a major supporter of the school over the years. So obviously it's a labor of love and heartbreaking at the same time to write this book, right? It's disappointment in the play. So how was the response from Northwestern?
No, the response was, and I saw a dean who told me off the record that an email had gone out. I was on, for example, the Medill Justice, was something that's very important to me, and a great program at Northwestern that I was on the board of, I supported, was the Medill Social Justice Program. Now it's called the Medill Investigative Journalism Project. And that's just one example where I was on this group and I didn't even get an email saying I was off. I just got no more communication.
Oh, that's called being canceled in a way, right?
I was being, in a certain kind of way. I mean, look, it's not a big deal. It's not a huge deal to me in the sense of, it's disappointing more than anything else.
It is a huge deal. It's wonderful that not personally you're not feeling it that way, but of course, in simply not responding or cutting you off, they are violating the motto and the rule that should inform academia. You've made serious, deep, thoughtful criticisms of some professors and some policies and some behaviors on this campus, and the right thing to do is respond to them. Either those criticisms are accurate and on target, in which case they have to make changes, or they disagree with them, but then the onus is on them to explain why they don't think these criticisms are fair or accurate. To simply not respond or cut you off is exactly the behavior you're calling attention to. So it is a big deal. This is a university not acting like a university.
I'll have to tell you one other thing that surprised me, which is I gave a talk that to a group that was organized by JUF, and there were a number of there were alumni, there were parents of students at Northwestern, and really surprised me at first. But I got a number of comments from people, both personally and otherwise. Why did you have to write this about Northwestern? Yes, it's all true. There's nothing that I just, they'll say there's nothing that I dispute. But, our kids go there, they're having a good time. It's shining not an unfair, no one said that, but it's shining a negative light on Northwestern. Couldn't you have written about something else, made it more general? And, it's really funny in that one thing that has been researched, people have written books on it during the whole period of, like the 20s to the 60s, when Jews were subject to a quota system at Northwestern and of all the Ivies for sure, and a number of other schools, that the Jews who graduated actually had very fond feelings about their schools, even though they knew there were quotas, and they knew there was anti-Semitism. And so parents at Northwestern and students and Jewish professionals, without getting too personal, why did you have to write this book? So I was actually taken aback. I wasn't expecting that reaction.
And I mean, I
That's
thought that
the
you
reaction.
were, that's the reaction. Right.
That was the reaction.
And do you have an answer to that question, I guess, is what I was expecting. So why did I have to, I found it very effective because, first of all, the book is not just about Northwestern, and that's clear.
Yeah.
You use Butts and particularly Thrasher. Thrasher represents really the whole academy across so many campuses. And it makes it, in my view, just more gripping that there's one individual who we're focusing on, but it's also clear this person represents, the large scale trend. And while Butts doesn't so much refer to a large scale trend on campuses, especially in the last couple of years, he is absolutely reflective of a large scale trend just in society at large. And so these are individuals, and it's about Northwestern, but it's so clearly about the larger problem, and making it focused in that way, I think, just makes it more relatable and just it's more gripping, I think.
Well, we're one thing, and look, we just had an election yesterday. I mean, we've become a tribal world. And so if you're part of the Northwestern tribe, even though, if you're a Democrat, and even though you disagree with certain Democrats who are on the fringe, you sort of still feel like you have to defend the tribe. Obviously, the same thing goes on in the Republicans. And I think there's a little bit of that going on. But look, I wrote this book, definitely not, in sadness, not anger. As I have that little vignette in the book. I really I would love nothing more than if Northwestern would emulate Morningstar and actually listen. I mean, the fact that we were able to talk to them. I mean, I flew to Chicago with this group, other people were involved. We sat down and we talked more than several times. And if Northwestern, my, sort of aspiration would be, my hope would be that folks at Northwestern would take it seriously, as opposed to coming up with a few talking points to dismiss the book. It's the opposite of what the academy should do.
Exactly. So on that note, let's get back to your book. So thank you so much for joining us. This was really a lot of fun. I would actually love to keep going. Maybe we can do this again some other time, but it was such a treat to have you join us here, and we'll spend the rest of the session continuing on with the book, because we're actually just getting into the thick of the book right now. So we've got plenty to cover. So Scott, thank you very much for being here, and I hope to talk to you soon.
A pleasure. It's definitely a pleasure.
All right. Thank you. All right, let's get back to the book. So I'm going to zip ahead and zip through just last week's slides, just so we can remind ourselves where we are. So give me a second to get there. This last week, we were up to about here. We started with the book, The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And what we established was that conspiracies violate the motto and the golden rule and should have no place on a university campus. Couldn't be clearer. That's a clear theme of that part of the book. We looked very quickly at how Butts representing the right wing and Thrasher representing the left can be and should be seen as conspiracy theorists. These are some of the conspiracies that Butts holds to. Here are some of the conspiracies that Thrasher holds to, as we discussed last week. We noted both demonize Zionists and Jews in various ways, and the racial lens through which they look at Jews is going to be a recurring theme. We'll perhaps get a chance to talk more about that tonight. We paused to think about the malleability of anti-Semitism, the many forms it can take. Basically, Jews come to represent whatever it is that's hated by that particular anti-Semite. That brought us into part 2 of the book, which is time to engage with these conspiracy theories and refute them. And we noted, on the one hand, they really are easy to refute. They're not only improbable, but demonstrably untrue. But of course, it can be very hard to dislodge a conspiracy theorist from his conspiracy theory. But nevertheless, it's important to try. We talked briefly about refuting Butts and mentioned Deborah Lipstadt's book. And we got up to about here. This is about where we were last week. So we were underway in refuting Thrasher. So let us remember Stephen Thrasher, as Scott was just talking about a moment ago, a recently hired professor at Northwestern. In fact, he was hired after the numerous tweets that we hopefully will get a chance to talk about tonight. So Northwestern hired him in full awareness of his positions and these conspiracy theories that we just went through very quickly a moment ago on a previous slide. So what we have in Thrasher are the what are really now standard academic left-wing accusations against Israel, that it has committed and continues to commit ethnic cleansing and genocide and settler colonialism and apartheid. And we went through these quickly a little bit last time. All are easily refutable. And just a reminder, to start with population numbers, for example. And if you look at the population of Arabs in 1948 versus today, I actually looked up some numbers. The Arab population has increased 12-fold in these years, which is exactly the opposite of ethnic cleansing and certainly the opposite of genocide. We know what population numbers look like when there's a genocide. They decline precipitously. This is going exactly the opposite direction. Settler colonialism is an absurd charge. The Jews' incredible long history in this land. When you dig the soil, you dig up Jewish artifacts that are 1,000, 2,000 years old. Charles Krauthammer recently passed away, commentator, famously said, Israel is the only nation on earth that inhabits the same land, bears the same name, speaks the same language, and worships the same God that it did 3,000 years ago, which is exactly the opposite, of course, of colonialism. And with respect to this apartheid charge, which at some point it would be nice to get into great detail, it is utter nonsense. There is equality under the law in Israel. Arabs serve in all areas of life, work, government, courts, share the same beaches, the same buses, the same cafes, et cetera, et cetera. And when we talk about international law a little bit later, we'll spend a few moments looking at how anti-Israel activists utterly corrupt or pervert international law in order to find Israel guilty of things. So with respect to this apartheid charge, which has become a popular one, in particular in the last couple of years, they literally changed the meaning of the internationally legal meaning of apartheid in order to find Israel guilty of apartheid, i.e. Israel's not guilty of apartheid as it's properly understood, but they find another definition that they try to smear Israel with. So all of these are easily refutable and blatantly false, which is, of course, the mark of a conspiracy theory. Moving forward into some of the more specific conspiratorial claims endorsed by Professor Thrasher. As Scott puts it, the conspiracy to genocide, he literally ends up inventing atrocities in order to find Israel guilty of genocide. So here's a tweet from May 2018. These are one of the tweets that Scott was referring to, again, prior to his being hired by Northwestern. He said, This was in reference to, you might remember, what they called it, the March of Return, when in Gaza, thousands and tens of thousands of people were attempting to breach the border fence, led by Hamas terrorists, to break into Israel and return. And Israel defended itself and defended the border there. He wrote, "Disinterested parties in the slaughter in Gaza should pay attention for its horror, but also out of self-interest. Israel used drones to gas people," he says. Israel used drones to gas people. First of all, slaughter, there was absolutely no slaughter. My slides aren't advancing. Someone just texted me. I hope you see the refuting Thrasher slide. That's where we are. I don't know what I can do on my end. So we're talking around about page 43 of the book. And Thrasher has just accused Israel of using drones to gas people and slaughter in Gaza. There was no slaughter. It was a precise military operation that focused on the terrorists who were trying to breach the fence. He uses this phrase, to gas people, drones to gas, it's a terrifying phrase, drones to gas people, deliberate use of Holocaust imagery, giving you the impression that it was Zyklon B, the Nazi gas that was used in these concentration camps, or the nerve gas of Saddam Hussein. It was tear gas, non-lethal tear gas, which was used to deter Gazan militants from crossing this international boundary to kill Jews, which was what they were planning to do. And by the way, all governments defend their borders, and it's very common for governments to use tear gas to disperse mobs. But he's phrased it as if Israel is slaughtering people with poison gas, comparing Israelis to Nazis and to other evildoers. Consider this other tweet from that same period. "As the Nazis did on Jews, homosexuals, and the disabled, as enslavers did to Africans, and as U.S. police departments have on Black urban neighborhoods, U.S.-backed Israel is testing the limits of what it can get away with in controlling humans in Gaza. Will the world care?" So first, notice the way he links Israelis with all the evildoers in the world. Very smooth there. Of course, Israel's blockade on Gaza is a legal, legitimate measure against a hostile military enemy under international law. Civilian supplies are allowed through. It's a blockade. It's not a siege. Israel has no boots on the ground in Gaza. It doesn't occupy Gaza. It doesn't control anything that's going on in Gaza. If Israel could control what's going on in Gaza, I have a feeling it wouldn't be subject to tens of thousands of rockets being shot at it on a regular basis. Etc. But somehow this is comparable to the way Nazis treated Jews, which was to round them up, expel them, deport them into camps and murder them. It couldn't be less similar to that. More fabrications. That same tweet continues. "Colonial powers, the US, apartheid South Africa, and Israel, test weapons of war on colonial subjects before bringing them home to the metropole," he says. And similarly, "Watch how US-backed Israel is using them on Palestinians. Drones will be used on rebellious people of color in the US soon enough." So he's got this idea that Israel has this plan or program of testing weapons, and then has a plan to use them on minorities back home. And there's some link between Israel and the United States, so that when Israel uses these weapons, they're going to find their way to the United States. The claims are, of course, ludicrous on their face. This is just legitimate self-defense, Israelis defending themselves from a genocidal enemy in Hamas, as opposed to a plan to test weapons and then export them throughout the world. Bogus comparisons. "Ferguson to Gaza" is an unfortunately very popular phrase used by Thrasher and used by many of his ilk, including and making reference to this deadly exchange program. I think we mentioned it last week. That's the name given. This was an initiative, just to remind you, by Jewish Voice for Peace, which is a fringe, probably not much Jewish anti-Israel organization. And there have been a small number of police exchanges where some United States police departments send some members to Israel for basically counterterrorism training with their Israeli police counterparts. And JVP has launched this campaign basically saying that because of these few exchanges, and the numbers are very, very small, basically police brutality in the United States is due directly to Zionist influence on American police. That claim, again, on the face of it, is ludicrous. There have been a very small number, a handful of people have gone. These trainings have nothing to do with actually police tactics. They're typically counterterrorism trainings. And in fact, they advocate that police should get to know and develop personal relations with members of the community. They're not about racial profiling, et cetera, et cetera. So this whole thing is a conspiracy, as if the Zionists are trying to export police brutality into the United States. It's a way of blaming Israel for what they take to be American police brutality. And of course, Ferguson, if you remember, that was back in 2014. There was an unarmed Black teenager was killed by a white police officer. And that was part of the wave of several similar incidents culminating in George Floyd. Some really terrible stuff, obviously, that Americans have a lot to reckon with there. There's, of course, no comparison between Ferguson and Gaza. There is no analogy between the United States police relationship to African Americans in urban neighborhoods and Israel's relationship to Hamas in Gaza. Start with the fact that Hamas is openly genocidal, trying to murder as many Israelis as possible. And African Americans, United States are not trying to do that to the police. So you can just start there and go on. So these are absurd comparisons and easily refuted. And there's more like that. The claims that Zionists strong-arm the establishment, control the establishment. Once again, we saw a little bit of this last week. Ordinary political activities, Jews, people who support Israel, they lobby the government, they support politicians. We just had an election yesterday where, AIPAC and J Street and others are giving money to political candidates who support their positions, et cetera, et cetera. Everybody does this. Muslims do it, Arabs do it, African Americans do it, the soap industry does it. It's an ordinary political activity, but this is twisted as Zionist strong-arming the establishment. Again, it's just simply false. And this, of course, is common methods. And it's important, we've been rushing through these, obviously, but it's important to be able to refute them, because what moves this program so effectively through campuses, through these BDS resolution student governments, they just start flinging so many accusations that you lose track of the truth after a while. And it's important to be able, one by one, to refute them. Looking at Butts and Thrasher, or right and left with respect to the Holocaust, Butts, of course, denies it. Thrasher does not deny it, but both accuse the Jews of abusing and exploiting the Holocaust for Jewish purposes. It gets that phrase, playing the Holocaust card. To mention another person of the same ilk as Thrasher, Stephen Saleta, now disgraced academic. He is someone who was essentially, if you may have heard of him, he was unhired. He was allegedly hired by the University of Illinois, but they withdrew the job offer or canceled it, depending on who you believe. This was back in 2014 because of an extensive series of social media activities that were basically horrifically racist and anti-Semitic. He claims, of course, that he's being silenced for criticizing Israel or being silenced for supporting the Palestinians. But in fact, maybe a little bit later, we'll look at some of those tweets, but they are just viciously anti-Semitic, wishing death on Israelis, for example. So he essentially claims, with respect to the Holocaust, that Zionists supported the Holocaust. Zionists supported the Holocaust in collusion with the Nazis in order to support the takeover of Palestine and the subsequent purging and genocide of the Arabs there, and that Zionists only bring up the Holocaust in order to obscure the genocide that they themselves committed against the Arabs in Palestine afterwards. So it's essentially a multi-generational geopolitical conspiracy right from the outset, from the beginning, the Zionists were colluding with the Nazis on this operation to build up Zionism and to build up the Jewish population in Palestine. It was like a whole cabal. And the ultimate point and goal was to get the Jews to Palestine and then expel or murder all the Arabs. So this is Salada's conspiracy theory with respect to the Holocaust. And this is all, of course, linked to the defamatory canard that Jews and Israelis are the new Nazis, that the Israelis do to the Palestinians what the Nazis did to the Jews. In terms of debunking the whole thing, I'm sure this audience doesn't need that to be debunked, but it's important to be able to debunk it. What is one thing to keep in mind, and this is not uncommon in a conspiracy theories we saw previously, there may well be some little kernel of truth that a whole narrative gets built around. So one little kernel of truth, and again, I am not endorsing this conspiracy theory, it's utterly malarkey, but in the early 1930s, before the final solution was underway, there were negotiations between Zionists and the Nazis to help Jews emigrate from Germany. They had a common goal at that moment. The Nazis wanted the Jews out of Germany, and the Zionists wanted the Jews in Palestine. So there's a common goal there. But that early negotiation, and these were negotiations about how to facilitate property transfer to make it a little easier for Jews to leave with some of their property, some of their assets, and make it to Palestine. That little bit of cooperation becomes collusion for the Holocaust itself, as if the Zionists were behind the extermination program, which is, of course, outrageous. What obviously drove Jewish emigration from Germany was the Nazi persecution, not Zionism. There were no Zionists involved in Nazi persecution. And indeed, tragically, many German Jews were resistant to leaving, and they stayed way longer than they should have, and even got trapped and even ended up dying because of that. Zionism is independent of and antecedent to the Holocaust. Zionism traces back 3,000 years to the earliest parts of the Bible. And even in the more modern era, it traces back into the 19th century, long before the Nazis came around. So the Holocaust is not at all the basis for Zionism. Jewish rights and the legal basis for Zionism long precedes the Holocaust. Some can and do make a moral argument for Zionism that the Holocaust, in addition to millennia of persecution and pogroms, make Israel, the state of Israel, morally necessary. But this argument supplements all the other arguments for Zionism, the historical arguments, the legal arguments, and so forth. And even if it didn't, not one single Zionist supported or colluded in the Holocaust in any way. Anti-Semitism made the Holocaust happen and thereby made Zionism morally necessary. Plus, of course, these folks utterly overstate the power of the Holocaust card. There are no shortage of anti-Zionists who are unimpressed by Jewish suffering in the Holocaust. And I would wager that not one Jew or Israeli ever invokes it to justify any Israeli action or policy. It's just irrelevant. The bogus comparison of Jews to Nazis or Israelis to Nazis, how do you even begin with that? We could go on. They're so clearly bogus, not to mention offensive, that it's obviously what's going on there is an attempt to delegitimize the state. Israel is as evil as the Nazis, and what's evil, especially as evil as the Nazis, must be resisted and ultimately exterminated. So these are some of the conspiracies with respect to the Holocaust, and they are debunkable and need to be debunked. The whole thing is a conspiratorial hate theory entirely removed from the facts. So in short, the right anti-Semitism embraces and advocates for the Holocaust, right? They supported the whole idea of it when they're not busy denying that it ever happened. The left, more interestingly, loves dead Jews. And here I deliberately refer to the title of Dara Horn's excellent book this past year, People Love Dead Jews, absolutely worth reading. The left loves the dead Jews. And what that means here is they claim to mourn the Holocaust victims. The Holocaust was a horrible tragedy, they will say and acknowledge, and we're opposed to anti-Semitism, the genocidal anti-Semitism that produced the Holocaust. So they've got Those Jews who died have all the sympathy in the world from the left. But then what do? They instantly condemn the Jews who managed to escape the Holocaust as refugees via Palestine, and they call them white supremacist colonial genociders. Right? So it's pretty clear there. They mourn the dead Jews, but they would prefer the Jews be dead Jews than actually living Jews who got out and escaped as refugees. They essentially affirm the horror of the Holocaust. They affirm the horror of the episode, but they don't draw what really is the obvious lesson regarding the moral necessity of the Jewish state, of the land of Israel. And that's just a hard thing to understand. It becomes so obvious to anyone who studied the history of the Jews, the modern history of the Jews, 19th century anti-Semitism, the vicious pogroms in Russia, the Nazi persecution, and the final solution, that if there can't be a morally stronger case for the establishment of a Jewish state, somehow the left manages to condemn the Holocaust and not draw the obvious lesson from it. And by the left, I mean Thrasher and the movement that he represents so thoroughly. Why these conspiracy theories are not merely false, so we've just been debunking them rather quickly, rather rapidly. But the key thing to recognize is they're not merely false, they're crazy. That's Scott's language. They're upside down. They're utterly divorced from reality, right? You can have false theories that are reasonable about things that just turn out not to be right. Science is filled with all sorts of theories that turn out to be false. That's just the normal progress of knowledge. It works that way. But conspiracies, these conspiracy theories, are not merely false. They're so divorced from reality. They're upside down. They're backwards. They're crazy. And that, of course, illustrates that what they really are expressions of hate. They're not legitimate theories about the world. Again, you can have a reasonable theory that turns out false. That's normal. That's not what these are. These are so divorced from reality. The only ultimate explanation of their grip on people is that they are expressions of hatred. So a couple of ways to make that point. Both sides, right and left, see the Jews as a monolithic unity and as vastly disproportionately powerful in the world. That's quite clear. The Jews, in fact, are a very tiny, tiny group divided amongst itself. Ask two Jews, get three opinions. And they operate like all other ethnic groups operate, with normal interests and pursuits. And perhaps in some regions like the United States, they are disproportionately successful. If they're 2% of the population, maybe they're 4% of the professions. So that's great. But even as 4% of the professions, you're not powerful. It's basically mathematically impossible for Jews to be particularly powerful when they are 2% of a population or 0.02% of the globe population. I actually had a student come up to me. She's a lovely student. She's figuring things out. And we've just been studying 19th century anti-Semitism in a class that I'm teaching, and first introduced to the Rothschild conspiracies, and we're just actually looking at protocols of the Elders of Zion a little bit. And she said to me, it is true that Jews own half of the wealth in the world, or something close to that. Half of the wealth in the world. This person is not an anti-Semite. I need to make that very, very clear. She's just reading stuff, and she read something somewhere, and happily I was there to disabuse her of that. I don't have exact statistics, but I'm pretty sure if Jews are 0.02% of the world's population, it will be mathematically impossible for Jews to have 50% of the wealth in the world. Just take a look at major countries like China and India and the United States, et cetera, et cetera. It's just not possible to entertain that thought. Right? And yet anti-Semites do. Jews are vastly disproportionately powerful to reality. They have crazy conceptions of Jews and race. We talked about this a little bit earlier. For butts on the right, Jews are obviously just not white. They're fake whites. They're pretenders. More importantly for us on the left, as we've seen for Thrasher and the left, Jews are basically white Europeans and part of the overall system of white supremacy. And one of the many strong parts of the book, I think Scott goes into a detailed refutation of the idea that Jews, and even if we focus on North American Jews, let's say, that Jews are white Europeans. It's not just false, but it's really crazy. The absurdity of calling Jews white, given their history in Europe and even in America in the first half of the 20th century, Europeans refused to allow them to assimilate, did not consider the Jews European. We're reading a whole bunch of texts in this class I just mentioned, and one after another, it's like the Jews are trying to like fit in, but they can't. They're foreigners. That's the way they were understood. Even after emancipation gave Jews something like equal rights in various European countries, Europeans did not consider them Europeans in large numbers. Plus, half of the world's Jews are not European, but Middle Eastern, North African, even Asian, and even some 10 to 12% of American Jews define themselves as Jews of color by today's racial categories. Moreover, labeling Jews as part of white supremacy is offensive, not just false, but offensive, both because actual white supremacists are in the business of murdering Jews and attacking Jews, and this is going on rampantly right now in the United States for anyone who's following the news. And Jews have often been and continue to be leaders in civil rights and progressive movements, all about protecting marginalized communities and advancing the rights and opportunities for marginalized communities. So they are not part of white supremacy. In fact, Jews are a multiracial, multicultural ethnic group, some of whom may count or self-identify as white, some of whom may not. But in the eyes of Thrasher, Jews are white and therefore part of the white supremacist movement. Because they see Jews that way, they will also see the Israeli-Palestinian conflict through this lens. They see it as white supremacist Israelis oppressing, genociding, because the comparison to Nazis is never far behind, Palestinians who are people of color, persons of color. You cannot find a more absurd lens, in my opinion, of understanding that very complex conflict than that. Whatever it is, it's not a racial conflict. Israelis occupy the entire spectrum of racial category, from very dark to very, very light. Palestinians occupy a large spectrum from very, very dark to very, very light. It is a national conflict. It is a religious conflict in some respects. What it is not is a racial conflict. And of course, the danger of seeing it as a racial conflict in our environment today is this leftist progressive ideology that Thrasher represents sees whites as being in positions of power and being oppressors, and people of color as being powerless and being oppressed. And so when they look over at Israel, that's what they, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, they see Israelis as being the oppressors and Palestinians as being the oppressed. And that is just not true. It's a lot more complicated than that. And so it's no surprise that they are deeply, deeply anti-Zionist. This view of Jews, which is ultimately, I would argue, a racist view of Jews, seeing them as part of white supremacy, immediately turns them into anti-Zionists. And that's why anti-Zionism is so powerful on so many campuses today. When you appreciate not just the falseness, but the craziness, the absurdity of these positions, and we'll see we'll do one more slide and then we'll wrap up. We'll see in a moment that it utterly reverses the whole settler colonialism paradigm, literally upside down, backwards, in reverse. When you see that, it's just so clear that these theories violate the motto, which, remember, represents academic and moral integrity, and of course, the golden rule. Again, you can have a false theory that can be perfectly reasonable. It turns out to be false. That won't violate the motto and the rule. But when you see how divorced from reality, upside down, backwards, these conspiracy theories are, it is clear they violate the motto and the rule. So let's close with, we'll do one more slide. Refuting the settler colonialism, imperialism charge. It's not merely false, but it's backwards. It literally reverses the situation. If you know the history and the story, in fact, it's the Arabs who are the settlers, the colonists, and the imperialists. I don't have it here, but if you just look at it's a very well-known map of the Arab world versus Israel, or especially the Muslim world versus Israel, what is it, 22, 23 Arab countries taking up a large part of the Middle East and North Africa, and tiny, tiny little Israel there, and Muslim majority nations, some 50, 53 of those taking up a large chunk of the globe, and tiny, tiny Israel. When you look at that map, and you look at the spread of language, the places that speak Arabic, and the spread of Islam on that map of all the Muslim countries, what you realize is the Arabs essentially came from the Arabian Peninsula and conquered large parts of the world and brought Islam with them. That's just a basic piece of history. Another word for that is imperialism and colonialism. Arab countries, especially right around the establishment of the State of Israel, expelled 800,000 Jews who had lived there for centuries, generations and generations. These communities go back to ancient times, some of them. They were expelled in the course of a couple of years, 800,000 Jews. Most had nowhere to go, no choice about where to go, but to Israel. The world was very inhospitable to Jewish refugees then, and now, I would say. The point is, Jews were refugees. They were not colonists. They were expelled by the people who had colonized those large regions of the world. In fact, Israel is the paradigm of what should be, and explicitly is the ideal of the left progressive movement here, the indigenous rights idea that indigenous people should be returned to their land. That is the opposite of colonialism. It is anti-colonialism. The Jews, as we know, had 1,200 years of either a sovereignty or autonomy in the land of Israel before the Roman conquest, and got sent into the diaspora. But Jews remained, there were always Jews in the land of Israel, even as the population was smaller after the exile. They never left the land of Israel. And meanwhile, there were a series of imperial colonialists: Rome, Byzantium, the Arab Muslims, the Christian Europeans, the Crusaders coming in, the Ottomans, the British. The establishment of Israel was an indigenous people reclaiming its land and throwing off the yoke of colonialism and imperialism. Right? In fact, there is no more legitimate country in the world, I would argue, but we're running out of time. Let me just add this little point, this wonderful quote from former Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin. If you want to ask about the legitimacy of the country, in addition to the historical and legal arguments, Begin at one point said, "We bought it, we built it, we bled for it." There is no more legitimate country in the world. It is anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist, fighting off the people who in fact are the true colonialists. So this isn't merely debunking the charge of settler colonialism against Israel. It's pointing out that they've got it backwards. It's entirely the opposite, which is as blatant a violation of the norms of academic and moral integrity as you can possibly imagine, a blatant violation of the motto and the rules. So that's what we've got. I think we're over time today. So if you're interested, I would love to engage with questions, but feel free to email me. You can find me via my website, andrewpesson.com. You can connect with me there. I'm happy to keep the conversation going or answer any questions that way. But we will continue next week. Session 4 will be next week, same time, same place. Feel free to invite friends. It's okay to join in the middle. I think they'll still get something out of it. And it was a pleasure to talk to Scott tonight. I hope you all enjoyed that. And I look forward to seeing you next week. So we're done for tonight.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Pessin. Thank you,
Thank you.
Scott, and everyone who joined us. Like Dr. Pessin said, our next webinar will be Wednesday, the 16th, 7:30 Eastern Time. This session has been recorded and will be sent out via email tomorrow. So thank you all for coming, and I hope you enjoy your evenings.
All right. Thank you so much.
Bye.